The sun rose slowly over Cincinnati's quiet streets, painting the morning sky in hues of orange and gold. Alvar stepped into the daily grind, a local cafe loved for its rich coffee and charming ambience. Inside, the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the gentle buzz of conversation. For Alvar, this was a routine stop, a quick black coffee to jumpstart his day before heading to an early meeting. The line wasn't long, just a handful of people ahead, so Alvar slipped into place near the back. With his phone in hand, he began sifting through emails, mentally preparing for the tasks ahead. The soft chime of the door opening went unnoticed until she walked in, a woman in her 40s, her movements sharp and purposeful. Her eyes darted around the cafe as if she were already annoyed, the click of her heels echoing as she joined the line behind him. At first, Alvar barely registered her presence. Mornings often brought their fair share of impatience, especially before caffeine had a chance to work its magic. But her audible huffing soon drew his attention. He chose to ignore it, assuming she was just another rushed customer. However, her muttering grew louder. "Some people have no manners," she said, her voice just loud enough to carry. Alvar glanced over his shoulder, unsure if her comment was aimed at him or merely a passing frustration. Her pointed glare made it clear it was directed at him. He raised an eyebrow in silent acknowledgement but turned back to his phone, choosing to stay focused on his emails. He had encountered moments like this before, subtle jabs too inconspicuous to challenge, but something about her tone felt more deliberate, more cutting. As the line inched forward, Alvar stepped closer to the counter, maintaining the usual space behind him. That's when her voice pierced the air, louder now, with a sharp edge. "Excuse me, you just cut in front of me," she said, her accusation hanging in the suddenly quieter cafe. Alvar blinked, momentarily taken aback. He turned to face her fully, his calm composure unshaken. "I've been in line since I came in," he said evenly, his voice firm but not confrontational. Her expression darkened. "No, you weren't. I've been standing here, and you just shoved ahead like you own the place." Her words carried enough volume to draw the attention of nearby customers. Conversations hushed, and the cafe grew uncomfortably still as eyes turned toward the brewing tension. Alvar stood his ground, his posture relaxed but resolute. "I think you're mistaken," he replied, his tone steady. "I didn't cut in line." Her arms crossed, her voice rose further, thick with indignation. "Of course you'd say that. People like you always think the rules don't apply to them." The weight of her words sank heavily into the room. A palpable tension rippled through the cafe as her voice sharpened the atmosphere. Alvar noticed the uneasy glances exchanged between a couple near the window, the barista's hesitance at the counter. The situation felt precarious, but Alvar refused to meet aggression with aggression. Taking a deep breath, he maintained his composure, even as she stepped closer, her fingers stabbing toward his chest. "I know your type," she spat, her words dripping with venom. "Always taking what doesn't belong to you. Cutting lines, breaking rules, typical." The word typical landed with the force of a slap. It carried an unspoken meaning that everyone in the cafe felt, but didn't dare acknowledge aloud. Alvar's chest tightened, but his exterior remained calm. Around him, the silence grew heavier, every eye fixed on the confrontation. By the window, the couple shifted nervously. Behind the counter, the barista's hand hovered near the phone, ready to intervene if the situation escalated further. And yet, no one expected what Alvar would do next. Alvar took a steadying breath as the weight of the woman's words hung heavily in the cafe. The murmur of shock and disbelief from the patrons had subsided, leaving an almost deafening silence. All eyes were on him, but Alvar felt the focus wasn't just on what had happened, it was on what he would do next. This wasn't just about him or her, it was about how everyone in that room would respond to what had just unfolded. He straightened his posture, his expression calm but resolute. "What you just said," Alvar began, addressing the woman directly but loudly enough for everyone to hear, "isn't just an insult to me. It's a reflection of something deeper. A choice you made here, now, in front of everyone, to show who you really are." The woman's face twisted, her earlier bravado faltering slightly under the weight of Alvar's composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," she muttered defensively, but her voice lacked its previous sharpness. "You do," Alvar replied firmly. "And so does everyone else in this room. Words like the ones you used, they carry a history, a weight you may not even fully understand. But for me, and for many others, they're not just words. They're wounds, reminders of pain, struggle, and resilience. And while you may have said them out of anger, what you've done is expose something much bigger than this moment." The patrons, who had been watching quietly, began nodding. A few murmured in agreement, the tension in the room shifting. A man near the back, who had initially looked uncomfortable, now leaned forward, his attention fully on Alvar. Alvar turned slightly, addressing the entire room. Moments like these are about choices. Her choice was to speak out of ignorance and hate. "My choice," he continued, his voice unwavering, "is to meet that with grace, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. We can't fight fire with fire. We fight it with water, with dignity, with truth." The barista, who had been frozen in place behind the counter, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "your coffee's on the house." "I'm so sorry you had to deal with that." Alvar offered her a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you," he said, "but this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. What we tolerate, what we stand for, or don't." The woman shifted uncomfortably, her earlier defiance now replaced with visible unease. "I didn't mean," she began, but Alvar raised a hand, cutting her off gently but firmly. "You meant what you said," he replied. "And now, you're facing the consequences, not from me, but from everyone here. The looks, the silence, the judgment, that's the world telling you that this isn't okay. That it never was." A man seated by the window spoke up, his voice steady and firm. "He's right. What you said was wrong, plain and simple. You owe him an apology." Others began chiming in, their voices carrying a mixture of condemnation and support for Alvar. "You can't just talk to people like that," one woman said. "What century are you living in?" another added. The woman's face turned crimson as she glanced around, meeting the disapproving stares of nearly everyone in the cafe. For the first time, she looked genuinely unsure of herself. She trailed off, her earlier confidence completely shattered. Alvar sighed, the weight of the moment pressing on him. "Apologies don't erase words," he said softly, "but they're a start. And if you're not ready to apologize, at least take a moment to think about the damage you've done. Not just to me, but to yourself, and to everyone who had to witness this." The room fell silent again, the patrons absorbing his words. After a few long moments, the woman finally lowered her gaze. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. The sound of her heels clicking against the tile floor echoed loudly in the quiet cafe. As the door swung shut behind her, someone near the counter began clapping. Slowly, others joined in, the sound building until it filled the entire space. The applause wasn't for her departure, it was for Alvar. For his composure, his strength, and the way he had turned a moment of hate into one of reflection and learning. Alvar stood there for a moment, letting the applause wash over him. He wasn't one for grand gestures or public displays, but he understood the importance of this moment, not just for himself, but for everyone in the room. As the clapping subsided, Alvar turned back to the barista, who was still standing near the counter. "Can I get my coffee now?" he asked lightly, his tone breaking some of the lingering tension in the room. A few people chuckled softly, and the barista smiled, clearly relieved. "Of course," she said, quickly preparing his drink. As she handed it to him, she hesitated. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for handling that the way you did." Alvar nodded, taking the cup. "Thank you for standing up," he replied. "Moments like this require all of us to do our part." He turned to leave, but before he could reach the door, a young woman seated near the corner table called out. "Wait," she said, her voice hesitant but determined. Alvar paused, turning to face her. "What you said, it mattered," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I think we all needed to hear that." "Thank you." Alvar smiled faintly.
"We all have choices," he said.
Every day. I hope you make the right ones. With that, he stepped out into the sunlight, the warmth of the day contrasting with the heaviness of the moment he had just left behind. Inside the cafe, conversations slowly resumed, but they were different now, quieter, more thoughtful. A couple by the window leaned closer to each other, their whispered words carrying the weight of what they had just witnessed. A man near the back pulled out his phone, muttering to himself, "I should call my brother. Haven't spoken to him in years." The barista returned to her station, her movements deliberate, her expression reflective. Everyone who had been there knew they would carry this moment with them, a reminder of the power of words, both hateful and healing, and the strength it takes to choose dignity in the face of ignorance. Alvar walked down the street, his coffee in hand, his mind still processing the confrontation. He didn't feel triumphant. This wasn't about victory. It was about progress, however small. And as he turned the corner, disappearing from view, he hoped that the woman and everyone else in that cafe would remember what had happened, not as just another argument, but as a lesson in humanity. "I'm not here to make a scene," Alvar began, his voice steady, though his gaze swept across the room, making eye contact with the patrons who had borne witness. "But I think we all need to acknowledge something. Hate doesn't grow in a vacuum. It thrives in silence, in indifference. Moments like this are opportunities, not just for me to stand up for myself, but for all of us to decide what we'll tolerate in our spaces." The cafe remained silent, but the energy in the room shifted. It wasn't the awkward, tension-filled quiet from before. It was reflective, almost heavy with thought. The barista, who had been watching Alvar intently, nodded slowly. Her arms crossed over her apron, her face resolute. "You're right," she said, her voice soft but steady. "And for what it's worth, I'm sorry you had to deal with that here." Alvar offered her a small, kind smile. "It's not about this cafe," he replied, shaking his head slightly. "It's about what we do next. How we respond, not just in this moment, but the next time we see something like this happen. Every day, we make choices that either build bridges or burn them." Near the window, a young woman raised her hand hesitantly, as if she were back in a classroom. I just want to say thank you," she stammered, her cheeks flushing pink, "for handling that the way you did. I don't think I would have been as calm or as brave." Alvar's smile widened slightly, his expression softening. "Bravery isn't about not feeling angry or hurt," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to ease the tension in the room. "It's about choosing what to do with those feelings. We all have that choice." The man from earlier, the one who had initially spoken out in Alvar's defense, chimed in again. "And you made the right one," he said, nodding firmly. "That took strength, man. Real strength." The atmosphere in the cafe continued to evolve. What had started as a tense, almost suffocating moment was now something else entirely, a shared experience, a spark of solidarity. Conversations resumed, but their tone was different. People leaned in closer to each other, their voices lower, more thoughtful. They shared stories of standing up to injustice, of moments when they'd wished they had spoken out but hadn't. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was a quiet buzz of introspection, a collective acknowledgement that they'd all been part of something bigger than a morning coffee run. As Alvar collected his coffee, the barista reached across the counter and handed him a second cup. Her eyes were warm but determined. "For the road," she said with a wink. "And for being the kind of person we need more of in this world." Alvar chuckled softly, accepting the gesture. "Thank you," he said, his tone sincere. "But remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about showing up when it matters." He turned toward the door, but as he reached it, he paused, looking back at the patrons. "One last thing," he said, his voice carrying easily over the soft hum of conversation. "Moments like this, they don't just happen here. They happen everywhere. And every time they do, we have a choice, to stay silent or to stand up. Choose wisely." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Alvar stepped outside, the crisp morning air filling his lungs as the door swung shut behind him. The sunlight seemed a little brighter now, the world a little lighter. But even as he walked away, he knew the weight of that moment wouldn't leave him. or the others, anytime soon. He paused on the sidewalk, looking down at the coffee cup in his hand. The warmth radiating through the cardboard sleeve reminded him of something his late grandmother used to say: kindness isn't weakness, it's power. Because it takes strength to choose it. Her words echoed in his mind, guiding him as they had so many times before. He glanced back at the cafe, catching a glimpse of the patrons inside. Conversations were still flowing, their faces animated but thoughtful. He couldn't hear their words, but he didn't need to. The story of what had happened was already traveling beyond those walls, carried by their voices, their actions, their reflections. Alvar's thoughts turned briefly to the woman. Her anger, her ignorance, the pain she carried, it was all still fresh in his mind. He wasn't naive enough to believe his words had changed her, but maybe, just maybe, they had planted a seed. Change wasn't about instant results. It was about planting seeds and trusting they'd grow, even in rocky soil. Inside the cafe, the ripple effect continued. A young man near the counter turned to his friend, his voice quiet but firm. I've been meaning to speak up about that guy at work. The one who always makes those jokes. Maybe it's time I said something. An older woman sitting near the window nodded thoughtfully to herself, as if making a silent promise to do better. The barista, back at her station, moved with a renewed sense of purpose, her expression one of quiet determination. Alvar didn't need to see or hear any of it to know it was happening. He could feel it. Change was rarely loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and persistent, like water carving its way through stone over time. As he walked down the street, Alvar's mind lingered on one final thought. Moments like these weren't just about responding to hate. They were about creating ripples. Every action, every word, every choice had the potential to inspire someone else to think, to act, to grow. He smiled to himself, the warmth of the coffee cup seeping into his hands. Kindness wasn't weakness, it was strength. And strength wasn't about overpowering others. It was about lifting them up, even when they didn't realize they needed it. Alvar turned the corner, disappearing from view. But the impact of his actions remained, etched into the memory of everyone in that cafe. They would carry it with them, a reminder that dignity wasn't something anyone could take away. It was something only you could choose to surrender. And Alvar? He would keep walking, keep choosing kindness, and keep planting seeds. Because in a world filled with darkness, even the smallest light could make all the difference.